I'm Matthijs Douze. I'm a research scientist at Facebook AI Research, and I'm going to talk about image similarity at scale. So the outline of the talk will be, first I'm going to talk about the basic tool that we use, which is to compare images with global embeddings. Then I'm going to talk about how to compute those embeddings, how to compare images or image embeddings at scale, and then how is that useful, what can we use that similarity for in terms of image indexing or image classification. And the last question is we're going to look at what happens when we have a trillion scale index of images. So first about embeddings. So I'm going to ask this question. Who wants to do end-to-end training? So if you look at Google Scholar, it looks like end-to-end training is quite popular because it guarantees a kind of optimality in theory. So end-to-end training means that we take an input image here at training time, and then it goes through a huge, large composite model with intermediate losses and all kinds of blocks, and then we get the result and we train that whole process end-to-end. The problem is that the models are very complex. We need to manage multiple losses, regularization terms, etc. It's hard to find data sets, especially for specialized tasks that are large enough to be able to do the end-to-end training. And in the end, it's not always easy to assess whether the model that we obtain is actually good. So who wants to do end-to-end training? Not me. So easier is to, instead, it's to break down the problem. So we have generic image features that are extracted from a frozen model that's trained, for example, on ImageNet. And then those features are a kind of information bottleneck that goes into a small downstream model that is going to solve the task that we want to handle. This enforces a kind of independence between the actual image representation here and the task that has to be performed. And the best possible image feature that we have in this space is the embedding. So embeddings. Embeddings are fixed size, dense vectors that correspond to some type of content. So for example, it can be images like what we have here, but it could be also text or posts on social media or videos or users or even relationships. And those embeddings are inputs to all kinds of downstream tasks that are typically classification tasks, which might be low-shot learning or with few training examples, or dynamic when we add dynamically classes to the problem. And another downstream task is to do detection or segmentation. And in that case, we will take local embeddings as inputs that come from activation maps on the model. And the problem that we are interested in is image similarity. And I'm going to talk about this mostly in the remaining of this task, this talk. So extracting image embeddings that work with image similarity. What does that mean? That means that we want to build an embedding that is comparable with either L2 or cosine distance, and we want that embedding to be generic enough to be used for several tasks. So for this, we're going to look at the different granularities that exist in the embeddings that can be compared. So what I mean by granularity is that you can compare images and determine whether they are exactly the same bitwise, or if they are duplicates of each other, or if they contain the same object instance, or the same fine-grained task, or the same coarse-grained task class. So for example, for classification, if we have two images of a car, of two different cars, the image or the embedding comparison can determine whether the two classes or the two images contain the same type of object in spite of intra-class appearance variations. And we want to discriminate this with other classes that are in general in classification. They are known, the other classes, and it's a finite set. And for classification, we will use a KNN classifier that consists in finding the nearest neighbor in embedding space and saying we are the same class as the class of the nearest neighbor. Then the second level of granularity is the instance level. So here we have exactly the same object, and we compare the two objects. We compare two views of the same object, and we want to be able to recognize it in spite of pose changes, lighting conditions, clutter that's around it. And we want to discriminate this object with other instances of the same object class. So meaning a different type of car, for example. And then there's an even finer notion of granularity, which is copy recognition. So if we have the same object that's taken once as an image, and that's manipulated in different ways, we want to be able to tell by comparing the embeddings that the images are the same in spite of overlays, filters, different image codecs, and to discriminate with other images of the same object. So for this, we have developed multi-granularity embeddings. That embedding is called multi-grain, and it can be used. So it's an embedding that's intended to be generic. It can be used for classification to determine that this image contains it's a college, that it's a certain instance of a college. It's that college and not another one, and or we can use that embedding to determine that it's the same image in spite of different image transformations. So to train that embedding, we are using a joint learning, which is trained by combining, on the one hand, a linear classifier, on the other hand, image similarity, and we combine those two losses that stem from the same generalized max pooling of an activation map. So the image similarity is computed from the triplet loss between three images, which means, and the images are made different by using data augmentation. So it's one of the first instances where data augmentation has been used for training, and in later years it has been used in lots of self-supervised training works like SimCLR, Bio, Moco, etc. So the results that we obtain using this kind of training is that the evaluation, so that we do an evaluation on both the tasks of image classification and instance search, and also near duplicate detection. And it turns out that this joint training improves for both tasks. It improves a lot for the classification task, and the classification loss improves a bit for the instance search task. So in the follow-up work, we have looked into learning fine-grained representations with coarse labels. And one very interesting test bed in that space is the iNaturalist dataset, which has no less than 7 different levels of granularity, because they are based on a biological taxonomy. So at the coarsest level, we have the kingdom, which is different between animals and plants, for example. And at the finest level, we have the level of the species, and then there are several different levels between them. So in that space, we are looking into how can we do effective KNN classification. And we do this via similarity search with embeddings, and assuming that we know only a certain level of coarse labels at training time, and we evaluate it using fine labels. So the model that we use to extract those embeddings is again a combination of two losses. It's one image identification loss, which recognizes image instances with data augmentation, and one is a KNN classifier loss, which is inspired by another work by Wu et al. So the two losses are combined again with a sum, with a weighted sum. And actually, what we look into at evaluation time is, okay, let's say we train at some coarse level and we evaluate at a finer level. So this can be shown in this matrix here, where we have the training level in the columns and the test levels in the rows. And so the interesting part is below the diagonal of the matrix. And what we show is that training this model that we call Graphite, comparing it with a baseline model that's trained in a classical way with only one of the two loss terms, we systematically outperform a graph systematically outperforms the baseline methods. So how can we visualize this? So let's imagine that at training time we only see those course examples with course labels. So we have one image of probably a newt, and one image of a butterfly, and one image of a bear. So that's the level of granularity we have of the labels that we have at training time. And then the fine labels, of course, are that the butterfly actually there are different species of butterflies that need to be differentiated. Then, when we look at K&N classification time, we take a query, a test query image, and we search it among the training images, and we see that the baseline method retrieves lots of images from different classes of butterflies, while our graphite embedding makes it possible to retrieve mainly images of the same class. Okay, so now that we solved the problem of getting appropriate embeddings, we're going to look into the problem of indexing large image collections. So basically, here we are back to similarities or nearest neighbor search problem in vector space. And for this, we can use the FAIS library that we developed, which is basically a C++ library with Python wrappers. And the basic object that we manipulate in this library is the index. The index means that it's an entity in RAM that contains all the vectors that we added to it, and that has a search function. So FAIS is used within Facebook. It's the main vector indexing tool that we use there. It has hundreds to thousands of use cases. It's also used in research papers, and it integrates very well with PyTorch. And outside of Facebook, it's open sourced. The paper has lots of citations. It's quite popular. And what we can do with it, so a few numbers. For example, we can perform billion scale search, a search in a billion scale data set. And in that setting, we can obtain 1,000 to 100,000 QPS. So that means that in 1 second we can search 1,000 to 100,000 vectors, depending on the setting. So there's a trade-off between the search speed and the accuracy, because if you want a higher accuracy, the search is slower. But it's the ballpark that we're looking at. So one of the interesting properties of FAIS is that it has a very efficient GPU implementation. And this can be viewed here. So if we index a data set with a certain speed on a single CPU core, we get search speeds of about 1 millisecond per query. If we use all the cores on the CPU, then we are at 1/10 of a millisecond. If we move to GPU, then we are close to 100th of a millisecond, so that's 10 microseconds. And then if we, this process scales very, very naturally to more GPUs, and there we are again gain a factor 10. So that means that from a single core to an efficient GPU implementation, we are at a factor 1,000 of speed. So the key element of the FAIS on the GPU is the warp select algorithm, which is basically a way of finding the top k elements in a stream of distances that are computed. And the implementation is based on a very careful exploitation of the different levels of registers that are available on the GPU and of the local memory. So here, the testbed that we'll be using for GPU is to do k-nearest neighbor graph building, which means that we want to find the neighbors of all the elements in a collection within that same collection. For example, indexing 1 billion vectors in a collection in brute force would take about no less than 100 exaflops of computation. So by algorithmic improvements, we can bring this down to about 10 petaflops. But then we need also the GPU optimization, which brings us down to only 1 petaflop, and which takes 4 hours on 8 GPUs. So that's the time to build the full KNN graph of 1 billion vectors. So now the question comes, how can we use those nearest neighbor graphs? So first I have to talk a little bit about the image collection that we're working with. And the testbed, the preferable testbed that we're using is the Flickr 100 million dataset, which is a public dataset of Creative Commons images. So the images contain the images themselves plus metadata in the form of tag, GPS coordinates, user IDs, and they are described with CNN features. So we can build a KNN graph in that collection to do, for example, image discovery. So given a collection of images, discover the groups of similar images. And so this is just a clustering problem. And so, for example, if we run the clustering on this Flickr 100 million dataset, and what's interesting is to look at the most compact clusters, and those compact clusters get pretty compact or meaningful, semantically meaningful elements on the clusters. For example, this set of buildings. So if we look at more coarser clusters, when they become less compact, then the elements don't look as uniform anymore. But examples that we get are like this, which are the same instance objects or the same location or the same type of animal, or this again the same type of animals. So clustering already gives a way of exploring images in the dataset. So it's a very useful tool. So now what we can also do with this KNN graph is to actually find paths in the graph. So we can just apply standard Dijkstra's algorithm to do propagation in the graph, and we can find paths between any two pairs of images because the graph doesn't have separate connected components. So between any two images we can find a path. So what do the paths look like? So for example, the path, let's take an easy example, which is a path between one image of a flower and another image of a flower. So we see that the path goes here from the yellow flower to a pink flower, and it's going to get progressively the same shape as the target image here. So another example, more tricky, is to go from a lion to a different species, which is a panther. And so we can see here that we go from lion. So lion jumps to male lion jumps to female lion here, and here it jumps to the panther and goes to the panther, which is the target image here. So one interesting example is when we have very popular landmarks that are well represented in the Yahoo Flickr 100 million dataset, we can take two viewpoints of that landmark and actually find a path that morphs between those two viewpoints. And this is without having any 3D information or any 3D training. It's just by image similarity between the two. So same object, different lighting. So obviously one object that has been photographed a lot and that has many instances in that dataset is the moon. So we can go from a croissant here to a full moon. And yet another example with animals, going from a dog here progressively to a cat. So it turns out that there are some races of dogs that are hard to distinguish from kittens here. So that's all very fun, but let's go back to hard tasks in computer vision. And one thing we have turned our attention to is low shot learning. So that's the setting where the training data is very sparse. So assume that we have only 1, 2 to 10 training images per class, and this is too little data to effectively train a CNN. So a typical approach is to train embeddings on another kind of dataset, typically ImageNet, and then build a logistic regression on top of that. So that's a typical approach where the breakdown of embeddings versus classifier is very relevant. The approach that we are exploring here is to use our large-scale nearest neighbor graph and use that to do propagation. So the way we do this is we take the few training images that we have, that we call seed images, that are labeled, and we take out the test images, and we're going to use similarity relations between the seed images and the test images. But we don't do it only with seed images and the test image. What we're going to do is we're going to add a large set of background images that are not labeled here. And we're going to construct the whole similarity graph between the seed images, the background images, and the test images. And then within that graph, we will do propagation. So propagation means the diffusion of labels between the seed images and all the other nodes in the graph. So this can be viewed as a matrix multiplication, matrix vector multiplication, and so there are some subtleties about how to normalize this all. And we can do this in several diffusion steps. So we do this, we iterate this multiplication several times, which corresponds to diffusion steps. And then after doing, between 6 and 10 steps, we look at what's the label that's most present on the test images. And it turns out that it actually works pretty well, especially in the very low shot regime with only 1 or 2 examples per class. So that means that it's competitive with logistic regression. And what's interesting is that actually the performance improves when the number of background images increases. So for example, here we have with just 1 million background images versus 10 million versus 100 million. You see that each step the number of the accuracy of the corresponding classifier improves. So this is very interesting, but in practice we have to say that the graph compression is actually quite slow, and so the practical use cases are not very obvious. But it's still interesting to observe that just by adding background images, which gives a better approximation of the distribution of natural images in the form of this nearest neighbor graph, actually improves the classification. Okay, so now we're going to look at searching between 1 billion to 1 trillion images. So the field of searching more than 1 billion images is the domain of large corporations because there's no public data set of that size. And in that case, what we observe is that the similarity search retrieves images that are more and more similar, just because the distribution of images is better represented with a larger number of samples. So for example, we worked on a set of Facebook images, a set of 1 trillion Facebook images. 1 trillion is 1,000 billion. And we wanted to make an index that has both high precision and high recall. So we developed this, and it turns out that we needed to have a high precision and recall. We needed to have a very accurate representation of the descriptors. So we needed to compress it into a relatively large representation, and which means that at search time we need between 400 megabytes to 1 gigabyte of data to read to perform a single image query. So yeah, we've spent quite a lot of time optimizing this, distributing this on several machines, and making sure that we don't outperform the network bandwidth. So we've been looking at a lot of this kind of Gantt charts where we look at what's the throughput versus the latency, etc. And it turns out that it's possible to do this kind of searches in around 1 second. And what kind of examples do we get here? So here I submitted an image, a query image into that index. And this query image, for example, gives us these results here. So what does that show? It shows actually that the nearest neighbors are very near to that query example, and that is because the space of images is very dense. And also in this case, the property that we also have is that this particular image is a stock image that has been reused for other purposes. So this is also another typical example. So this view of the Taj Mahal, we can find literally hundreds of thousands of views that are very, very similar. So this means that the density of the sample of images, the sample of natural images that's represented in this data set, increases, which makes it more interesting to use similarity search approaches. Okay, so to wrap up, as a conclusion, so what I wanted to show here is that image embeddings are the key to efficient similarity search. The more images that we have, the better the coverage is of the natural image distribution. And it turns out that all Facebook images is a significant fraction of the existing images on the internet. I would like to flag that there are two NeurIPS 2001 challenges in this field. The first one is the Image Similarity Challenge, which aims at evaluating copy detection. And the second one is Billion Scale Indexing Challenge, which is about vector indexing. So those two challenges, I invite you to take a look at them. They tackle the kind of problems that we encounter when we do image similarity at scale. So here is a face page of all the co-authors that I've been working with, and I'm very grateful for the work that we did together. Okay, thank you.